sometimes I feel like authors' words live with me every single day. I read something and I feel like I take it on in a way. Um,
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing. It's like some books you read and you love, and you might not think about them again. And other books you read and they just live inside of you. And that's why I chose this book. I mean, I thought about so many books, but I kept coming back to this one because it just is a part of me now,
right.
and I'll never forget it.
Hey everyone, welcome to Without These Books. I'm your host, Allison Roach. Without These Books is the thank you inspired video podcast that celebrates the authors, books, and characters that changed us as writers, readers, and as people. So, today on our show, I will be joined by Rebecca Handler. She's a writer who lives and works in San Francisco. Her stories have been published and awarded in several anthologies, and she blogs regularly at onewomanparty.com. Aidt Richter is Not Alone is her debut novel, and in a starred review, Booklist writes, Handler's Aidt has joined the ranks of unforgettably eccentric, intelligent women protagonists. Kirkus starred review says a tragic comic exploration of the collateral damage of Alzheimer's disease. Handler gets it right from the title on out. Aidt is definitely not alone. Here's my conversation with Rebecca. So, what is the book that you chose to talk about today?
So I chose a book called When Death Takes Something From You, Give It Back. And it is by a Danish author named Naja Aidt. It is a memoir, actually, that she wrote after a couple of years after the death of her son, who was 25 years old at the time, who died tragically. It is not I wouldn't say it's a, feel good book. Some people might be surprised by my selection because I think a lot of people lean towards books that make them feel really good, particularly during a pandemic. For me, however, I found a lot of solace in this book. And when I was writing my own novel, which happens to be about grief and secret keeping and loss, that book is called Aidt Richter is Not Alone. I looked for books that had to do with grief and were very just blatant about what the grieving process is like. There's no sugarcoating in Naja Aidt's book at all.
Right. So around what time did you read it?
I read it it's funny because I think sometimes when you write a novel, everything kind of takes place like in or around that book. Like that's how you frame your time.
Yeah.
So I read this book towards the end of making edits to my novel.
Okay.
And I think it came out in 2019. It's been out in Denmark for a while, but the English translation came out in 2019. I read it soon after that. I was familiar with this author because she wrote a book called Rock, Paper, Scissors. That is a novel that I loved, that I read several years ago. There's something about the style of her writing that I find really inspirational. It's very accessible and very real. And so I knew that I had to read this book, and I was so sad to hear about the death of her child.
Right. So what are some of the main takeaways from this book emotionally for you? Like how would you describe how it impacted you beyond just reading it in conjunction with writing?
Yeah, I think what it did for me is as I mentioned, it's not really a feel-good book, but it does do this strange thing of showing you the absurdity in death, which I think is a tricky thing to write about. Death is, particularly the death of a child, is something that is just extraordinarily vulgar and awful and horrible and our worst nightmare. However, there is something always absurd and crazy in death, and even funny at points. And she does this beautiful job of showing some of the absurdity. For example, there's a passage that when she learns about the death of her child, there's a passage that she repeats throughout the book, which is exactly where she was, exactly how she heard the news. And if you've gone through something difficult in your life, you know that time tends to stop when you receive bad news, or if you're in a bad accident or something like that. And she does that through words. Like she really shows how time just stops and your brain can't stop processing what you've just heard. So she drops in the same passage during during the memoir, and it's so beautiful, and it becomes longer each time, and you can just like
Oh,
tell that her brain is receiving the information the way it needs to.
right. And adding to it as time goes, because things change as time goes, your perception changes, it adds things to it, you learn more. That's sounds beautiful.
It's really beautiful. Yeah, and it's like, when you receive a piece of terrible, horrible, unthinkable news,
Uh,
your brain has to put that somewhere in your body and it has to live in you. You don't get through grief, you just learn to live with it.
mhm.
And she shows how this nightmarish piece of news ends up kind of reincorporating itself into her body and into her mind. And she was able to write this book. And it's almost like she had to write this before she could write anything else.
Right. Yeah, you have to like get it out. There's nothing else. So sometimes when death happens, that's the only thing that you feel it that you can pay attention to. Like, how are you supposed to look at anything beyond that for a long
Yeah,
time?
exactly.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, so I definitely, used some of that inspiration and sort of as I was doing the final edits of my book, which is about a woman who is grieving after the loss of her father. And I was really inspired by the way that Aidt does that, is able to like incorporate language and memory and kind of reinvent a character.
Mhm. So you read it during the editing process. What is that? Did you go back and add things that you learned from the book, or like logistically, like I don't know. I'm just curious, like as a writer.
Yeah. No, I didn't. I mean, I believe me, maybe I was tempted to erase my whole book and just use her book instead. It's so beautiful. No, I think that what it made me do is feel confident in my choice to use some humor in describing grief. And it also helped me eliminate some phrasing that was just not realistic. I wanted the grief to be extremely palpable and true to the experience of losing someone.
Right. Yeah. So,
And I wrote her a fan letter.
oh, you did. You did. What did you say? You talked
Well, I
about.
wrote her I wrote her like a fan DM on Twitter.
Oh, yeah. I mean, that's like the modern version of a fan letter today.
Exactly. I know. I know.
Um,
I can never figure out how to write authors. I always want to. It's so hard sometimes to find their address.
yeah, it's hard to find their address. And it's also, to me, I find it hard to like, am I going to spill my guts and say how much you changed my life, or felt like I feel like you changed my life or changed my perspective? There's one thing that an author has impacted you, but it's interesting because sometimes I feel like authors' words live with me every single day. I read something and I feel like I take it on in a way. Uh,
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing. It's like some books you read and you love, and you might not think about them again. And other books you read and they just live inside of you. And that's why I chose this book. I mean, I thought about so many books, but I kept coming back to this one because it just is a part of me now,
right.
and I'll never forget it. She also talks a lot about like other bereavement literature she has read. She found that when she lost her child, she couldn't do anything for at least a year, and she couldn't even read anything. And the only things that she could like try to read were other works about bereavement. So she talks about that in the book too, which I appreciated because there's kind of like a whole grief landscape of work out there. So I learned more about other authors through this book too.
Oh, cool. Yeah. So, do you have a favorite passage or sentence that you have available to read if you'd like to?
Oh my gosh. I wish I could show you how many pages I have earmarked.
Oh, yeah. Love to see that.
Yeah, it's just so great. Um, so she writes in her, she uses some of her own journal entries
Mhm.
um, in this book. She also learns that her son was writing poetry and she didn't know that. And she only learned that after his death. So she uses some of his own poetry in her book that's dedicated to him. Yeah, this is just a sentence that I really like. She wrote in her journal, so this is about a year after his death, and he was a cook. He loved to cook. All the spices you bought and used are still in my cabinet, and every time I touch them, smoked paprika, curry, cayenne, I think about how it wasn't long ago that you touched them with your warm, living hands. And to me, that just says so much, because when someone leaves us, sometimes we can still feel them through their objects, and
Yeah.
particularly in cooking,
Yeah.
is a way to, carry someone on with you.
Right. Yeah. And food keeps you going, keeps you alive, keeps you nourishing. So it's,
Exactly. So it's like she's getting sustenance through his own spice collection that he was very proud of.
yeah, that's beautiful. So thank you so much for joining me to talk about this book. I love it and I'm going to add it to my list. It sounds amazing. So thank you.
Sure. You're welcome. Thank you so much for interviewing me. Nice to meet you, Allison.
Nice to meet you too. Join the conversation at withoutbooks.com.